boy's trembling hands scattered grain across the barn floor, as the first rays of dawn crept through the wooden slats, each kernel a stolen promise that could mean the difference between another day of survival and discovery, by the ranch owners who might shoot first and ask questions later. In the unforgiving mountains of Colorado Territory, where winter winds carved mercy from men's hearts and left only the hardest souls standing, 12-year-old Samuel knew that compassion was a luxury few could afford, yet here he was, risking everything for creatures that couldn't even thank him. The barn stood like a weathered sentinel against the backdrop of snow-capped peaks, its timber walls bearing the scars of countless mountain storms. Samuel pressed his small frame against the rough-hewn planks, listening for any sign of movement from the ranch house beyond. The silence stretched thick as molasses, broken only by the gentle lowing of cattle and the soft whicker of horses stirring in their stalls. His breath formed small clouds in the crisp morning air, each exhale a reminder of how exposed he was, how far he'd traveled from the abandoned mining camp he'd been calling home. The boy's clothes hung loose on his frame, patched trousers that had seen better days, a wool shirt that once belonged to his father, and boots with soles so thin he could feel every pebble beneath his feet. His sandy hair fell across eyes that had seen too much for someone barely past his 12th birthday, eyes that now darted nervously between the animals and the barn door. Each movement was calculated, practiced from weeks of this dangerous routine. "Easy now, girl," he whispered to the chestnut mare in the nearest stall, his voice barely audible above the mountain wind that rattled the barn's tin roof. The horse nickered softly, pressing her velvet nose against his outstretched palm. Samuel had been coming here for 3 weeks now, ever since he'd discovered this place during one of his desperate searches for food. The ranch appeared prosperous, well-maintained buildings, healthy livestock, and smoke that rose steadily from the chimney of the main house. But prosperity in these mountains often came with a price, and strangers were rarely welcomed with open arms. The grain sack felt heavier than it should in his small hands as he moved from stall to stall, dispensing measured portions to each animal. He'd found the feed in an unlocked storage room, and though his conscience gnawed at him with each handful he took, the grateful sounds of the animals made the guilt bearable. These creatures depended on him now, just as he depended on them for the warmth their bodies provided when he slept in the loft above, hidden beneath piles of hay that smelled of summer meadows and better times. Samuel's fingers worked quickly, efficiently, as he refreshed water troughs and spread fresh straw. The work reminded him of home, of the small homestead where his mother had taught him to care for their few chickens and the old milk cow. But that life felt like a distant dream now, buried beneath the avalanche that had taken his parents and left him alone in a world that showed little patience for orphan children. The mining camp had offered temporary shelter, but when the silver vein played out, and the miners moved on, Samuel had been left with nothing but his wits and an iron determination to survive. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the barn floor as Samuel worked. He'd learned the rhythm of this place over the past weeks. The ranch hands would emerge around 7, the owners shortly after. That gave him perhaps another hour before he needed to retreat to his hiding place in the loft. The thought of discovery sent ice through his veins, not just for himself but for what it might mean for these animals who had grown accustomed to his presence. As he knelt beside a pregnant sow, scratching behind her ears the way she liked, Samuel caught a glimpse of movement through a gap in the barn wall. His heart hammered against his ribs as he watched a figure emerge from the ranch house, a woman in a blue dress, shaking out a tablecloth in the morning light. She moved with purpose, her attention focused on her tasks, but Samuel knew that could change in an instant. Ranch folk had sharp eyes and sharper instincts, and a boy who didn't belong would stand out like a wolf among sheep. The animals sensed his tension, several lifting their heads to watch him with liquid brown eyes that seemed to understand his plight. In their quiet presence, Samuel found a measure of peace he hadn't known since losing his family. These creatures asked nothing of him but care, offered nothing but their wordless companionship, yet it was more than he'd received from any human in months. The thought of leaving them behind, of returning to the cold emptiness of the abandoned camp, made his chest tighten with an ache that had nothing to do with hunger. But as the woman's voice drifted across the yard, calling to someone inside the house, Samuel knew his time was running short. Soon, Very soon, he would have to make a choice that could change everything, or end it all. Samuel's hands, stilled on the sews, bristled back as memories of his sister's fevered face swam before his eyes. Little Emma, barely 8 years old, lay hidden in the ruins of their old homestead 3 miles down the mountain, wrapped in every scrap of fabric he could find. The medicine she needed, the real medicine from Doc Harrison's office in Silver Creek, cost more than Samuel could steal in a lifetime of raiding barns. But these animals, their warmth and the milk he could coax from the gentler cows, had kept her alive for another week. The woman's voice grew clearer now. "Thomas, you best come see this. Boot prints by the grain shed, small ones." Samuel's blood turned to ice water in his veins. He'd been so careful, always approaching from the rocky ground where his feet left no trace, but yesterday's rain had turned the earth near the shed to soft mud. His heart hammered against his ribs as he heard the heavy footsteps of a man crossing the porch, spurs jangling with each deliberate step. "Well, I'll be," came a deep voice, gravelly from years of shouting orders over mountain winds. "Fresh prints, Martha. Can't be more than an hour old." Samuel pressed himself against the barn wall, his slight frame fitting easily between 2 support beams. Through a gap in the weathered planks, he watched a tall man emerge from the house. Thomas wore the weathered look of someone who'd carved a life from unforgiving land, broad shoulders beneath a faded flannel shirt, hands that bore the calluses of rope and leather, and eyes that missed nothing. A Colt revolver hung at his hip with the casual ease of a man who'd needed it more than once. Martha appeared beside him, her auburn hair streaked with premature silver, and her blue dress practical rather than pretty. She studied the ground with the keen attention of someone who'd learned to read sign as well as any tracker. Small feet, child-sized. But what would a young'un be doing skulking around our place before dawn? The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke and bacon from their kitchen, and Samuel's empty stomach clenched with hunger so sharp it nearly doubled him over. He hadn't eaten in 2 days, saving every morsel for Emma, whose appetite had finally begun to return as her fever broke. Could be one of them orphan kids from the mining camp. Thomas mused, his weathered face creasing with thought. Heard tell the whole operation pulled up stakes last month. Left behind more than just empty shafts. Martha's expression softened almost imperceptibly. Poor little soul, probably half-starved and desperate. She paused, studying the barn with new interest. "Thomas, you notice anything different about the animals lately? They seem content, more so than usual." Samuel held his breath as Thomas's sharp gaze swept over the barn. The man moved with the predatory grace of someone accustomed to danger, each step calculated and purposeful. "Now that you mention it, yes. Found the water troughs fuller than I left them yesterday, and the stalls are cleaner. Someone's been caring for them," Martha whispered, wonder creeping into her voice. "But why? If they're stealing feed, why bother with the work?" The question hung in the mountain air like smoke. Samuel closed his eyes, remembering his father's weathered hands teaching him to gentle a spooked horse, his mother's patient voice explaining how frightened creatures needed kindness more than anything else. Even stealing felt less sinful when it came with care, with the gentle touch that reminded these animals they weren't forgotten. A horse whinnied softly from within the barn, and Samuel's blood froze as he recognized the sound. It was Patch, the old gelding with the white blaze, calling out in the particular way he'd learned meant someone should check his water. Samuel had trained him to that call over weeks of patient attention. Thomas's head snapped toward the sound. "That's peculiar. Patch only does that when," his eyes narrowed as understanding dawned, "when someone's been working with him regular like, teaching him." Martha's hand found her husband's arm. "Thomas, what if it's not stealing at all? What if someone's been helping?" The word hung between them, fragile as morning frost. Samuel felt tears prick his eyes as he thought of Emma's trusting smile, of the promise he'd made at their parents' graves to keep her safe, no matter what it cost. He'd expected bullets and curses when discovery came, not this quiet wonder in the woman's voice. But even as hope flickered in his chest, the distant sound of hoofbeats echoed off the mountain walls, multiple riders approaching fast from the eastern trail, their horses breathing harsh in the thin air. Samuel had heard those same urgent hoofbeats 2 nights ago, just before old Pete Murphy's cabin had burned to the ground. Samuel's fingers found the small silver locket hidden beneath his shirt, its metal warm against his chest from body heat. Inside lay a tiny photograph of his parents on their wedding day, and a lock of Emma's baby hair their mother had saved. He'd promised her, as the fever raged, and she called out for Mama in her delirium, that he'd find a way to make her well. The locket felt heavier now, weighted with that promise, and the knowledge that discovery might mean losing everything. Thomas stepped closer to the barn, his boots crunching on frost-brittle grass. "Martha, fetch my rifle. Whoever's been here might still be close." His voice carried the authority of a man who'd faced down claim jumpers and cattle rustlers, but Samuel caught something else beneath it, curiosity rather than anger. "Now hold on," Martha said, her hand on his arm. "Look at this work, Thomas. The stalls are cleaner than they've been in months. Water troughs filled proper, feed distributed even-like. This ain't the work of some thief." Samuel pressed deeper into his hiding spot as Thomas's shadow fell across the barn entrance. The man's weathered face appeared in the doorway, eyes adjusting to the dim interior. His gaze swept methodically across each stall, taking in details with the practiced eye of someone who'd learned to notice what didn't belong. "Patch easy now," Thomas murmured as the old gelding approached. The horse nuzzled his palm, then turned expectantly toward the corner where Samuel always kept the sugar cubes he'd managed to pilfer from the ranch house kitchen. The simple gesture made Thomas's eyebrows rise. "Well, I'll be damned. Someone's been spoiling you proper." The hoofbeats grew louder, and Samuel could now make out individual riders, 3 of them, judging by the rhythm. His mouth went dry as he remembered the stories whispered around mining campfires about the Brennan gang, outlaws who'd been working their way through isolated homesteads, taking what they wanted and burning what they left behind. Pete Murphy had refused to tell them where he'd hidden his silver, and they'd made an example of him. Martha appeared in the doorway beside her husband, carrying a Winchester rifle with practiced ease. "Thomas, those riders, I hear 'em." His hand moved instinctively to his Colt. 3 horses moving fast. Could be trouble. Samuel's heart hammered as he watched Thomas survey the barn one more time. The man's gaze lingered on the hay bales where Samuel had been sleeping, on the small depression where his body had pressed into the straw. For a moment, their eyes seemed to meet through the shadows and Samuel held his breath, certain he'd been discovered. But then Martha's voice cut through the tension. "Look here, Thomas." She knelt beside a feed bucket, her fingers trailing over something Samuel couldn't see. When she stood, she held a small wooden carving, a horse no bigger than her palm, whittled with the patient skill of someone who'd had little else to do during long cold nights. Samuel's chest tightened. He'd carved it for Emma during her worst fever, telling her stories about the beautiful horses they'd own someday when they had a real home again. It must have fallen from his pocket yesterday when he'd been rushing to finish his work before dawn. "Somebody's been living rough," Martha said softly, turning the carving over in her weathered hands. "A child, by the look of this work." "Thomas, what if?" The sound of approaching horses cut her words short. Through the barn's open door, Samuel could see dust rising on the eastern trail, and something cold settled in his stomach. The riders weren't slowing down, they were coming straight for the ranch. Thomas checked his rifle, his movements sharp and efficient. "Martha, get to the house, load the shotgun and keep it close." His voice carried the weight of experience, of a man who'd faced danger before and survived it. But Martha's attention remained fixed on the small wooden horse in her palm. "Thomas, there's a child out here somewhere, alone and scared." Her voice broke slightly on the words. "We can't just right now, we got bigger concerns," Thomas said grimly as the first rider crested the hill. Even from a distance, Samuel could see the man's slouched posture, the rifle across his saddle, the way he surveyed the ranch buildings with predatory interest. Samuel pressed the locket tighter against his chest, thinking of Emma waiting for him to return with food and medicine. The riders were almost here, and he was trapped between discovery by the very people who might help him and the approaching threat that could destroy them all. The lead rider wore a black hat pulled low over eyes that held no warmth, and Samuel's blood chilled as he recognized the crude brand burned into his horse's flank, a twisted B that marked him as one of the Brennan gang. Stories of their cruelty had followed them across 3 territories: homesteaders found with their hands bound, children left orphaned and wandering, entire families that simply vanished without a trace. Thomas stepped protectively in front of Martha, his rifle held ready but not raised, a careful balance between preparation and provocation. "Afternoon, gentlemen. You lost." The lead rider's smile revealed teeth stained brown with tobacco. "Just passing through, friend. Heard tell. There's been some strange doings in these parts. Folks going missing, cabins burning." His gaze swept over the ranch buildings with predatory interest. "Thought we'd offer our services. Protection don't come free. But it's cheaper than rebuilding." Martha's knuckles whitened around the wooden horse in her palm, and Samuel saw her exchange a meaningful glance with Thomas. They understood the threat as clearly as if it had been spoken aloud: "Pay us, or become another cautionary tale," whispered around frontier fires. "Appreciate the offer," Thomas said evenly, "but we handle our own troubles." Samuel pressed deeper into the shadows as the second rider, a scarred man with a lazy eye, studied the barn with uncomfortable attention. "Nice stock you got here. Shame if something was to happen to him." The words sent ice through Samuel's veins, not for the animals alone but for what they represented: his lifeline to Emma, the only thing standing between her and starvation. He remembered her fevered whispers just yesterday morning, how she'd clutched his hand and asked if the pretty horses were real, or just another dream. He'd promised her they were real, promised her everything would be all right. Martha stepped forward, her rifle cradled with deceptive casualness. "My husband said we're fine. Might be best if you moved along before dark. These mountain trails can be treacherous for folks who don't know them." The third rider, younger than the others but with eyes already hardened by violence, spat into the dust. "Treacherous, she says, like that old prospector Murphy found out." He chuckled, a sound devoid of humor. Amazing how fast a man's attitude changes when his roof catches fire. Samuel's fist clenched around the locket until the edges bit into his palm. Pete Murphy had been kind to him, and Emma, sharing what little coffee he had and never asking too many questions. The thought of these men burning him alive made Samuel's stomach roil with helpless rage. But it was Martha's quiet gasp that caught his attention. She'd noticed something, a small movement in the hay where Samuel crouched, or perhaps the glint of the locket chain at his throat. Her eyes found his hiding spot, and for a heartbeat they stared at each other across the shadows. Instead of calling out, she took a deliberate step to her left, blocking the rider's view of the barn's interior. "Thomas," she said softly, her voice carrying a weight of meaning, "maybe you should check on the animals, make sure they're secure." Understanding flickered in Thomas's weathered features. He nodded slowly, never taking his eyes off the riders. "Good thinking. Sometimes livestock gets spooked by strangers." The lead rider's attention sharpened at the exchange. "Something we should know about. Wouldn't want to leave you folks with unfinished business." Samuel's breath caught as he realized Martha had placed herself directly in harm's way to protect him. This woman who didn't even know his name was risking everything. Her home, her husband, her very life, for a boy who'd been stealing from her. The weight of that kindness pressed against his chest like a physical thing. The scarred rider nudged his horse closer to the barn entrance. "Mind if I take a look? Like to know what's got folks so protective of their stock." Thomas's rifle rose almost imperceptibly. "I mind plenty." The moment stretched taut as a bowstring, 3 dangerous men weighing their odds against a rancher and his wife, while Samuel crouched hidden in the shadows with the power to change everything. Emma's face swam before his eyes, pale, trusting, depending on him to return. But these people, these strangers who'd shown him nothing but unexpected grace, were about to pay the price for his cowardice. The lead rider's hand drifted toward his gun. "Now friend, no need for unfriendliness." Samuel's grip tightened on the locket as he made his choice. Samuel stepped from the shadows, his small frame silhouetted against the barn's dim interior. The locket caught the afternoon light as it swung free from his shirt, casting tiny rainbows across the weathered wood. "Don't hurt them," he said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through his veins. I'm what you're looking for. The scarred rider's lazy eye fixed on him with predatory interest. Well, well, what have we here? Thomas's rifle swung toward Samuel, then slowly lowered as understanding dawned in his weathered features. This was the child who'd been caring for their animals. The small hands that had filled water troughs and spread fresh straw with such careful attention. Martha's sharp intake of breath confirmed she'd reached the same conclusion. Boy, Thomas said quietly, get behind us. But Samuel stood his ground, chin raised in defiance that reminded Martha of her own stubborn courage. They're after me because I've been taking your feed. Don't want you folks paying for my mistakes. The lead rider's tobacco-stained grin widened. Brave little rat. But we ain't here for feed thieves. His cold gaze swept over the ranch buildings again. We're here for the same reason we visited old Pete Murphy. Sometimes folks need convincing to be neighborly. Samuel's confusion must have shown on his face, because Martha stepped forward, her rifle trained steadily on the riders. They're not after you, child. They want protection money. Blood money. Understanding crashed over Samuel like an avalanche. These men hadn't come because of his thievery. They'd come to terrorize Thomas and Martha the same way they'd terrorized Pete Murphy and countless others. His reveal had changed nothing except to put himself in danger alongside the people who'd shown him unexpected kindness. Touching reunion. The younger rider sneered. But we got business to finish. Thomas's voice carried the weight of granite. Only business you got is riding out while you still can. The lead rider's hand settled on his gun grip. Big words for a man outnumbered. That's when Samuel heard it. The distant thunder of hoofbeats approaching from the western trail. Multiple horses, moving fast, and something about their rhythm spoke of discipline rather than desperation. The scarred rider heard it too, his head turning toward the sound with the wariness of a hunted animal. Sheriff's posse, Martha said with quiet satisfaction. Amazing how word travels in these mountains. Samuel watched the lead rider's confidence crack like ice in spring thaw. The Brennan gang's power lay in picking isolated targets, in striking where no help could come. But Pete Murphy's death had finally pushed the scattered homesteaders to band together, to send word through the mountain passes that enough was enough. The approaching riders crested the ridge, 6 men with badges gleaming on their vests and rifles across their saddles. Samuel recognized the lead figure as Sheriff Morrison, a man whose reputation for justice was as solid as the mountains themselves. Brennan. Morrison's voice carried clearly across the valley. You and your boys are done running. The gang leader's horse danced nervously beneath him as he calculated odds that no longer favored boldness. This ain't over, he spat, but his bravado rang hollow as he wheeled his mount toward the eastern trail. The 3 riders thundered away, leaving only dust and the echo of hoofbeats to mark their passage. Samuel stood frozen in the sudden quiet, uncertain whether to run or stay, until Martha's gentle hand settled on his shoulder. Easy now, she murmured, her voice carrying the same soothing tone she might use with a spooked colt. You're safe. Thomas approached slowly, his rifle lowered but his eyes kind. That was a brave thing you did, son. Foolish, but brave. Samuel's fingers found the locket again, and suddenly the words came pouring out, about Emma burning with fever in the ruins of their homestead, about the promise he'd made at their parents' graves, about the guilt that gnawed at him for taking their feed even as he tried to give the animals the care they deserved. When he finished, tears tracked down his dust-stained cheeks. Martha knelt beside him, her calloused hands gentle as she wiped them away. You got a sister needs tending, she said simply. Best bring her home. Thomas nodded, his weathered face soft with understanding. Ranch always has room for folks who know how to work, and anyone who loves animals the way you do. He gestured toward the barn, where Patch hung his head over the stall door, nickering softly at Samuel's familiar voice. Well, seems like they already chose you. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of hope, Samuel felt the weight of fear lifting from his shoulders for the first time in months. Tomorrow he would bring Emma home.